Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, patient advocate Donna Cryer, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives. On the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.
For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Episode 35 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami, our first AASLD summary of 2020, starts now. This is the end of day 2 of the Digital Liver Meeting, or AASLD 2020. I want to start by commending our colleagues Stephen Harrison and Manal Abdelmalek, along with Mazen Noureddin, who will be here tomorrow, for being part of a superb non-alcoholic fatty liver disease special interest group presentation yesterday morning. If you haven't listened to that session yet, go back and do so. Mazen and Manal did excellent work discussing how to identify patients at great risk. That was Mazen. And then how to treat them using current options. That was Manal. At the end, Stephen gave an illuminating and energizing vision of how drugs and diagnostics are likely to evolve over the next few years. And in the middle, Arun Sanyal and Rohit Lumba held a debate over whether we should target NASH resolution or fibrosis improvement in looking at new drugs and generally in therapy. Today's episode will run longer than usual for 2 reasons. First, our EASL episodes averaged 15 minutes longer than our regular weeklies, mostly because they were so packed with information and insights about 5 or 6 of the day's presentations and posters. Second, and only for tonight, we have an extra 25-minute section at the back of this episode sponsored by Sonic Insights Medical Corporation, developers and marketers of VeloCore, the world's first handheld liver health assessment tool with accuracy comparable to MRI. This extra discusses poster 1563, titled VeloCore, Initial Results in Discrimination of Patients and Healthy Volunteers Based on Fibrosis and Steatosis. Tomorrow at noon, Sonic Insights is launching the first part of the CHE webinar series, Latest Advances in Elastography and its Potential in NAFLD and NASH. So, this evening we have the regular crew, Stephen, Louise checking in at some ridiculous hour, Donna, who's been going all day, which is a long day for her, along with our good friend Manal Abdelmalek. Manal, welcome back again.
Thank you.
I expect this will be as much fun as the last time was. We have a lot of ground to cover this evening, so I'm going to jump right in. Okay. What I'd like to do is I'd like to use our conference special icebreaker, which is what's the most important or exciting thing you've read or heard since the conference opened? Brave one, go first.
Well, I'll go. During the Meet the Expert session that I did yesterday on treatment of NASH, Alina Allen, who is an assistant professor of medicine and the director of the NAFLD clinic at Mayo in Rochester, asked me a very provocative question. And this question had to do with a recent paper that she published. So it's not necessarily something that's being presented at AASLD, but it was something that was asked during my Meet the Expert session. So I feel like it's fair game to talk about because it was a very interesting and provocative question that had to do with a paper she recently published in Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology. And I encourage you to look at the paper. In that paper, she essentially linked liver stiffness measurement by MRI to future events, whether it was progression to cirrhosis in NAFLD or it was progression to decompensation in cirrhosis. And this was a study in over 800 people with long-term follow-up. And so ultimately, there was a lot of really good information. So I went and pulled the paper, and I'm just going to hit the highlights of it for you because I think it's worth all of us reading this paper because it can gain, I think it's going to help all of us in designing future clinical trials, specifically targeting those patients at greatest risk for progression to cirrhosis. If you're doing an F2-3 study, for instance, and if you're doing an F4 study, how quickly those patients will progress to decompensation, which are the endpoints that we're looking for. So, in the study, a total of 829 NAFLD patients were identified. 639 of them did not have cirrhosis, but 20 developed cirrhosis after a median follow-up of 4 years. The baseline liver stiffness measurement was predictive of future cirrhosis development with an age-adjusted hazard ratio of 2.93. As an example, she illustrated that a baseline liver stiffness measurement by MRE can be used to guide the timing of longitudinal non-invasive monitoring. So if you had a liver stiffness measurement of 2, it guided that another repeat would be necessary in 5 years. If it was 3, you you would repeat it in 3 years. And if it was 4 to 5 kPa, you would repeat it in 1 year. And it was really predictive of progression. I'm not going to go into any more detail because, again, we're just hitting the highlights of what we thought was provocative. To me, that paper and her comments and all the work that she's done on this is really insightful. And at least after the first day and a half of the meeting, I'm taking away that as something very informative.
That's a great start. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. It really is a fabulous meeting, and kudos to the AASLD for a virtual digital platform for this. It's pretty heroic. But I walked away with something fun, provocative, and fascinating. But the fascinating, was I also got a very provocative question during the SIG meeting from Vincent Wong, actually, who posed the question to me because I was talking about standard of care and the influence of diet and exercise and in the induction of weight loss on the histologic outcomes for NAFLD and NASH. And his provocative question was, well, Manal, if we can induce this much weight loss, even with GLP-1 agonists such as semaglutide, why are we not quite hitting the endpoints of fibrosis? And that got my wheels turning a little bit. Number one, certainly there could be insensitivities with the endpoints in clinical trials, but there could potentially be secondary variables which drug therapeutics in and of themselves may not be altering. And one thing that is influenced by diet and exercise is the influence of exercise on peripheral muscle and modification of peripheral insulin resistance. But diet brings into the element of what changes even occur with dietary modification with microbiota, which we know in and of themselves could be drivers of metabolic syndrome, as well as drivers for an inflammatory response that can influence liver disease. Scott Friedman was talking about precision medicine and the ability for machine learning to even be able to characterize and phenotype gut microbiota. And Anna May's talk on the influence of gut microbes and their secondary byproducts of these bacterial families in creating alterations of bile acids or other byproducts of their metabolic processes that could potentially influence liver disease. And what she said that I thought was fascinating was, what if we were able to create what the gut microbiota do in the form of a therapeutic drug in and of itself, because we may not be able to alter gut microbes because they change so readily under different circumstances, whether it would be sleep or diet or exercise or even getting on a plane. Do what they made that was beneficial to metabolism and liver disease. Wouldn't that be fascinating?
Very, very cool. Good start. Louise, Donna?
I'll jump in next. In fact, my session was one that was done today on the diversity part of the meeting, and it was done by Cynthia Gomez. And I have to say that, as Stephen would probably say, it blew my socks off. It was just such an enlightening and thought-provoking session on diversity and equity in the context of social and culture and status and health. And I think the way that it was presented and the way that designing clinical trials with diversity could be managed in some of the big diseases that we look at, if we could manage as well as she spoke about how this could be done, then it's a great template. So it was a very interesting and thought-provoking session, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Excellent. Donna?
So I really want to applaud AASLD for the progress that it has made for incorporating patients and patient advocates into this meeting. And it honestly has far exceeded my expectations. And part of that included a session on NAFLD and NASH at the patient lounge yesterday that was well attended, and it was such an important stride forward in terms of collaborations between patients and clinicians and researchers as we co-design and build this field forward, that I want to make sure that was remarked on and the kudos given to the organization for that. The most remarkable thing, though, for me about NASH that has happened during the time of this meeting actually happened outside of the meeting, that in a fantastically bipartisan move, the text was made available for the NASH Act as introduced by Congress. And so for the first time, we have a piece of NASH-specific legislation that is co-sponsored by a Republican from Texas, Congressman Dan Crenshaw, and Luis Ruiz, Democrat from California. And the bill HR 8658 would provide for prevention, surveillance, a National Academy of Medicine study, and would elevate the liver branch to a full division within NIDDK. And I just want to say that it's so important for us to recognize that all of the innovations that are being done scientifically throughout this meeting in NASH and for other diseases need to be supported by policy, by public health, healthcare delivery, and health equity policy. And so it is very exciting to know that those are, in fact, proceeding hand in hand.
Excellent.
That's fantastic news. So I feel like after all that, what I have is kind of prosaic, but I'm not sure it is. You may remember that several weeks ago, we had Ian Rowe from Leeds on, and Ian was talking about some of the work that they're doing there with the entire population of Leeds to sort out primary care and hepatology issues. Stephen got very excited, said, listen to these folks, listen to what they're doing. And Ian noted that his partner was a gentleman named Richard Parker. Richard Parker and Ian and two other folks from Leeds have drafted a poster of distinction in this meeting. It's number 640. It says early access to fibrosis testing and primary care reduces costs. I didn't see this until Thursday when we committed to our topic, so I might have chosen it. But fundamentally, what they've done, and Louise, this should be near and dear to your heart as well, is they went into 3 primary care practices and had them give ELF tests to triage any patient where they had reason to believe for metabolic reasons that there might be a risk of NASH. And what they did was reduced costs, improved patient satisfaction scores, and were able to identify 45 of the 1,450 patients that they tested faster. 3% of all patients, 11% of those reviewed in clinic, and they got to that result faster and cleaner than they would have had they not been doing their work that way. As I say, I thought that was really interesting, in part because it's great work, and in part because it comes from the stuff that he was telling us about a month and a half ago. So, Stephen, I think your excitement at that moment was well-founded already, and they're just at the beginning. We're going to try to have Ian back on in a couple of weeks on a different topic, but kudos to those guys. That's great stuff they're doing there. Why don't we get going? Louise, why don't you go first? Take about 5 minutes, tell us about your abstract and that you're covering and what was in it and what you learned from it.
Well, it's great that it follows your discussion about poster 640 and Ian Rose, because I chose the oral presentation 56, which was done in the NAFLD session this evening, and it's non-invasive assessments to identify patients with advanced fibrosis due to NASH, screened population from the Regenerate trial. And it was presented by Jerome Broussier from France, but it's got quite a distinguished set of co-authors included in that. So basically what they did was they took the 4,133 patients who were included in the Regenerate phase 3 study, which, as we know, is the OCA study, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with multi-centers. And what they did was look at the 5 non-invasive tests with their established cutoffs. And what they wanted to do was look to see whether or not there was any evaluation on this set of non-invasive tests to look at whether or not the biopsies could be removed in real life care, I suppose. So the ones that they chose were APRI, ELF, FIB4, NAFL fibrosis score, and transient elastography, because they were used in most of the trial centres. Now, when they got down to it, the testing methods, they chose to look at each of the tests singularly, then simultaneously in NAFL fibrosis score and ELF, FIB4 ELF, NAFL fibrosis score, transient elastography, and FIB4 with transient elastography, and then sequentially. But they only did the sequential tests if the first test was indeterminate. So the baseline demographics on the patients' mean ages were 54, and transient elastography group very much mirrored the primary set of patients at baseline. Now, only 41% of the entire cohort received a FibroScan, and when it got to the ELF test, I think there was no patients in stage 4 or stage 0, and that was purely because all of those patients were already randomized onto the study, and those patients weren't included. So similarity across the fold of the patients. So when it looked at the simple tests and transient elastography, ruled out fibrosis in approximately 40 to 60% of the patients, and the lowest rate of indeterminate tests was transient elastography, so FibroScan. So of the 1,700 patients, FibroScan, or 41% of that population, the NITs with the lower thresholds demonstrated really good sensitivity for identification and of early fibrosis, where ELF was 100% and FibroScan 88. Single non-invasive techniques, the upper threshold demonstrating strong specificity for identification of advanced fibrosis with FIB4 at 97, NAFL fibrosis score at 94, and APRI at 86. But for all tests, the negative predictive value was really good, between 80 to 90%, with positive predictive being suboptimal at 60 to 70%. So then they looked at simultaneous tests, and these were based on the agreement of the fibrosis tests. So, and NAFL fibrosis score with ELF, FIB4 ELF, NAFL fibrosis score, FibroScan, FIB4 FibroScan. So what they did was look at the diagnostic accuracy was simultaneous with excellent sensitivity and specificity, with over 90% positive predictive value when they got to those tests. However, it did increase the number of indeterminate results. So then we looked at the sequential tests. So NAFL fibrosis score then went on to ELF, FIB4 then went on to ELF, or NAFL fibrosis score going on to FibroScan, and FIB4 to FibroScan. So the percentage of indeterminate patients was really reduced compared to the simultaneous algorithms, and the percentage of fibrosis 3 and 4 predicted was 20% to less than 30%, but the percentage of F0 and 2 was higher, greater than 60 to 70%. But there was a decrease in sensitivity, although the specificity was maintained and negative predictive value was 80%. What they then looked at was age. And if you had a FIB4 profile in patients of greater than 65, the indeterminate doubled compared to those less than 65. But when they added the FibroScan to the FIB4 simultaneously, there was a big increase in indeterminate ranges, which obviously we don't want. But then by adding it sequentially, it actually removed that effect in both age groups, so it became far more accurate. So, and I think the long and short of it was that taking the non-invasive tests and reanalyzing them in these big studies, they came out with routinely available tests may have a great diagnostic performance to discriminate in advanced fibrosis to NASH. The sequential non-invasive strategies may decrease the need for liver biopsy while maintaining accuracy, which is what we want to try and reduce the amount of liver biopsies, and that particularly will be in Donna's court. But no single test they proved had optimal sensitivity and specificity. And generally, when they had large indeterminate zones, which is obviously undesirable. So what they looked at, the simultaneous increased accuracy, but expanded the indeterminate range, and the sequential maintained accuracy, reduced the misclassification, but there was a reduction in the sensitivity. So the potential for the real-world setting to be able to use simultaneous or particularly sequential non-invasive tests, as we've discussed recently, may well have some great merit. And I commented and I thought at the time about Ian Rowe and his team in Leeds, and I noticed he'd asked a question also at the session. But there's also some other presentations and posters very much now describing the use of sequential non-invasive tests to more home patients that we're going to diagnose or biopsy. And I think going to your little bit there, Roger, if we can get access to these serial tests in a primary care location, it may well really enhance the referrals that the hepatology teams see in secondary care. And the ones that we need to see with the most urgency might be the ones that we pick out better if this can be replicated in real life. And Ian's poster 640 does well on that. So that was my paper for the day, and the potential to put it into real life, it always excites me.
I also saw that paper, and one of the things I found myself thinking was, I was thinking about the AROC for NIS4 and for what we're looking at possibly for some of the other tests that are coming, may have better AROCs than what we're accustomed to. And if that's the case, then the presence of a better liquid test should only improve the model that Dr. Boursier and his colleagues laid out. So I think it felt to me like a decent first step on a very promising pathway. Not that we've gotten to the end yet. I think sensitivity needs to be better. But if we start with tests that do better and we try more ways to get here, I think it's a very promising way to go. And Donna, as you point out correctly, you could go through 3 or 4 of these at times to get a patient through biopsy. So that's pretty easy.
Yeah, I was on that paper that Jerome presented. And I think the thing that struck me as we put that together was the reinforcement that sequential testing is better than multiple testing at baseline or an individual test. I think it really is summarized well if you were able to see the post-grad course today where Elliot Tapper elegantly described beyond a biopsy or liver disease without a world without a biopsy. And he had a slide in his presentation where he basically built on what Jerome presented today, except he also had MR elastography in there as well as FibroScan as the second test. And he broke it down into the different age brackets of FIB4. So less than 45, between 45 and 65, and over 65. And then the sequential test was a FibroScan or an MR elastography. So I would encourage the listeners to go back and look at Elliot Tapper's presentation. It is on demand, so you can pull it up for the next several days and take what Louise shared today, the abstract that was presented today, and overlay that with his presentation. It is phenomenal. And I think it gives us a lot of clarity on a potential way forward. Not the ultimate final way forward, but I think it's a next step. And I think Jerome did a great job today of presenting that. Thanks for showing us that, Louise.
No worries, and I hope I did it justice. It always makes me nervous when I present one of your pieces of work.
You did fabulous.
There you go, Louise. Take that to sleep with you tonight, at whatever hour you finally get to bed. Yeah. Speaking of people who want to get to sleep, Donna, you're up next. Go ahead.
If Stephen is experiencing Wi-Fi issues, I'll defer because I want to make sure that his voice and insights are captured because they're essential to this effort.
No, you are way more essential than me. When it comes to requirement for essential workers, I would stay home and you would have to go to work. So, look, I think go ahead. I've got my hotspot on, we're good. So you take off.
So I chose to look at, listen to, and present 0060, clinical characteristics used for machine learning identification of fast progressors amongst patients with NASH. This was presented by a good friend to the podcast, Jorn Schattenberg. And so, his work is always well done and so relevant. I really liked that this used real world clinical data. Because I think that's very important to take advantage of in this research, and also because it focused on progression, which is so important to be able to look at a set of patients and not only know where they are, but where they're going, and really essentially, how quickly. So anything that answers that question, I think, is a really important to this effort. So this study in this group that Jorman's leading was based on an Optum database, so payer data. And I want to point that out, having worked with 2 of the payer research organizations, this data is very, very rich and fascinating. And so what they were looking to do, and they had previously developed a machine learning model called FastNASH, a map of 44 features to identify NASH patients at risk of fast progression to cirrhosis and or hepatocellular carcinoma. And they're comparing the characteristics of the fast versus what they call standard progressors. The methods, as I started off with, a really essential feature of that was the Optum de-identified EHR database that they were using. Database is an oversimplification, of course, but the EHR infrastructure there from 2007 to 2018 data, so fairly recent. And what they did, I thought, was quite quite clever. So this is a retrospective longitudinal, of course, electronic health records. And so they looked at patients who had a diagnosis of cirrhosis and NASH, and then they looked backwards to identify an index date. And so they looked to see what was the earliest diagnosis of NAFLD or NASH. And of course, we know we've recently improved that with refinements of the ICD-10 code. So hopefully the research of this type can even be better. There's also, and I'll mention this up front because it did come up in questioning, they did include in the creation of that index date what they call proxies. And some of those proxies were type 2 diabetes, obesity, hyperlipidemia, or hypertension. And so that may ultimately sort of confound the results. But those results are, and these are amongst over 4,000 patients. They pulled out an intermediate group that was about half of the patients and really looked at the fast progressors who went from this index date to the endpoints of cirrhosis or liver cancer in less than 3 years, and a standard progression group of those patients who took 6 years or more to achieve those endpoints. And they call the model that emerged a light gradient boosting model. And what emerged for them were that the fast progressors had a higher mean age, ALP, AST, the AST-ALT ratio, bilirubin, and two things that I find really fascinating: the rate of change of ALP. And I think that rate of change is something that is, I would speculate, and I love to hear discussion on, would be harder for the average human to catch or notice in the trends of the data for an individual patient. And also amongst the fast progressors that I found fascinating in the model was frequency of anxiety disorders. So was there some element of patients recognizing that there was something going wrong with themselves that wasn't yet recognized in a formal code? So the standard progressors had, or the fast progressors lacked, had a lower mean albumin, LDL, cholesterol, hematocrit, platelets, triglycerides. It's interesting that a lot of the cardiovascular manifestations and numbers in the fast progressors turned out to be, normal or at least quite a bit lower than in the standard progressors. So I think this helps us refine what we should be looking at as the predictors of fast progression. And so the takeaways were basically that fast progression can be predicted by machine learning, that this can be a complement to hepatologists. You're also in the oral presentation, postulated that particularly, as we expand, the search for NASH patients beyond hepatology, that this may be particularly helpful to non-expert clinicians who, unlike most AASLD members, aren't used to looking at NASH patients and identifying them from an array of often amorphous, sometimes even conflicting symptoms. And so I think that being able to use machine learning and use it on data sources that are this sort of ongoing infrastructure and this search that's independent from clinic visits in and of themselves is a really important advance in the field.
So I actually attended the AASLD Japan joint session on lean NASH this morning. And because every theme that comes around goes around, Steve, and Alina Allen presented there as well with some of the work, some work on that. And that's going to be presented in greater detail in a paper that I think Dr. Omar Ahmed is doing, I think it's 086 later, on what they found in Olmsted County on lean NAFLD. But my recollection of the Ahmed paper, more than what Dr. Allen showed this morning, is that it had a common pattern, Don, to what you just described, which is that the lean NAFLD patients they identified had a higher percentage of faster mortality, but a lower percentage of comorbidity, including metabolic comorbidity. In fact, my reaction to that entire session was to wonder, Stephen's made this observation in the past, whether lean NAFLD is pretty good proof of the idea that you shouldn't call it MAFLD, because lean NAFLD clearly isn't metabolic in the same sense that what we conventionally think of NAFLD is. But yeah, so I loved Jorn's paper, but I viewed that as validation, both for his paper and for some other things that I've been seeing in this meeting and over the last couple of weeks. I
just had a thought while I was listening to Jean, but more looking at his figure, the baseline demographics, and that over 60% of the population that was studied were women. And again, when I look back at the Regenerate data, 60% are women. Now, NAFLD is stronger in men, isn't it, than women overall? So these studies and more of these studies would suggest that women, and I just wonder the age range, whether or not menopause was taken or recorded in these women as to whether they were menopausal or postmenopausal, or whether that could skew any of these sort of figures in fast progression. It was just something that when I was listening to him and looking at the figures and then looking at these ages and sex in these sort of studies, whether or not there are considerations in fast track, particularly if we're starting to see a higher percentage of women in these groups at the ages that we're now looking at, mid-50s. It was just something that struck me, because 2 or 3 years may not be statistically significant, but it can be quite significant in a female body change, and if it's part of the demographics in these studies.
Actually, that's an excellent point. And we don't account for the biological variability and gender differences that can occur across the spectrum of life in women. And there is data that certainly estrogen may very well be protective against rapidly progressive hepatic fibrosis and biology even pertaining to estrogen in the hepatic stellate cells. And that once women become postmenopausal, the liver biology, in fact, parallels that of men in fibrosis progression. So we have not historically, although there's increasing evidence that we should, as a field, account for gender variability in biology as we design experiments and as we design clinical trials, and using that as a potential covariate for disease severity in clinical research.
I know that Florence Hazeltine and the founders of the Society for Women's Health Research would be cheering on this, this whole line of conversation. And I think this also shows the different conversations you get when you have diversity within your panels. So kudos to you, Roger, for having a majority female panel here for this podcast. The
goal originally was to make sure that the permanent panel was 50-50 on gender and had enough diversity in it in terms of perspectives, ages, careers, and all that we'd have lots of different ways of looking at things. And then whoever came and joined us would simply tilt the balance slightly in whatever direction he or she showed up in. Stephen, any comments or thoughts on that paper, or shall we go on to you?
Donna summarized it very well. Your comments and the comments that Manal had, I think, were spot on as well. My task was to review abstract number 1710, which is a poster of distinction. It just so happens I'm the first author on it. So I hope I speak with some understanding about this. It's an exciting piece of work to talk about, because I don't think I've ever been a part of a study that was started off with such a bang, was put on clinical hold, an expert hepatology group comprised of 3 hepatopathologists plus the original 2 pathologists for a total of 5, and 3 expert DILI hepatologists with an additional 3 general hepatologists that are well respected in the community, were convened to review all of the data. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the clinical hold was lifted by the FDA. And fortunately, seladelpar is now going to be initiated again for phase 3 in PBC. And actually, Gideon Hirschfield will be presenting that data at this meeting for PBC. So my task today is to review abstract 1710, which is essentially the phase 2B trial in NASH patients. So it's a 52-week multi-center double-blind randomized phase 2 study of seladelpar, which is a potent and selective PPAR delta agonist in patients with NASH. And so that's my charge. I think before I jump into that, it would behoove me to briefly review PPARs. So peroxisome proliferation activating receptors, or the so-called PPARs, are a part of a superfamily of nuclear hormone receptors, and they can be classified as PPAR alpha, PPAR delta, and PPAR gamma. You guys all know pioglitazone is a PPAR gamma agonist. It's been associated to improve NASH histology. Elegant work done by Ken Kuzi, really a world-renowned endocrinologist in the field of NASH. He's pioneered the studies with this molecule. Unfortunately, its utility is limited by development of weight gain, particularly water weight gain, and exposure of right-sided heart failure. PPAR alpha agonists induce hepatic fatty acid oxidation and really work towards reducing the metabolic overload that is thought to be a driver of NASH. When you look specifically at the fibrate class of drugs, which are PPAR alpha agonists, they've kind of been disappointing. So we don't really use fibrates directly for NASH, but we have looked at PPAR alpha in combination with other PPARs. So PPAR alpha gamma, that's seraglitazar, and then PPAR alpha delta, which is elafibranor. That's late breaker number 23. I'll be talking about that on another podcast related to the digital AASLD experience. So having said that, let me pivot back to this poster. So PPAR delta agonism ultimately results in inhibition of bile acid synthesis, decreased circulating lipids, including cholesterol and triglycerides, and also reduces hepatic inflammation and fibrosis. So the objectives of this study were to assess the safety and efficacy of seladelpar, which is a PPAR delta agonist, after 52 weeks of treatment in patients with biopsy-confirmed NASH. Now, the main study assessments were liver fat content using MRI-PDFF. That was the primary endpoint. Histologic changes in NASH and fibrosis, and serial serum measurements for liver enzymes and lipids. The primary endpoint, again, change in liver fat content at week 12, but the study continued blinded to week 52 with an end of treatment liver biopsy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the sponsor terminated the study when initial 52-week liver biopsies were judged to have quote unquote unexpected liver pathology in about 30% of tissue with portal and periportal inflammation, along with some bile duct injury in the presence of immune cells being the major findings. A subsequent independent investigation found these histopathology observations were also present at baseline and not caused by seladelpar. So the study, like I said, ultimately all these liver biopsies were obtained at 52 weeks and are reported here today. The baseline characteristics of the randomized 181 patients had a mean liver fat content of 22%. That's very good. Mean NAFLD activity score of 5.2, and 83% had F2 or F3 stage fibrosis. Most patients were obese, half were diabetic, and the majority of patients were on lipid medication, with lipids generally well controlled. When we look at the change in liver fat content as the primary endpoint, all doses resulted in significant decreases of 10 to 21% from baseline to week 12, with the largest effect, unfortunately, being an unexplained decline of 21% in the placebo group, with no significant differences between the groups. At 52 weeks, there was an irregular pattern in the change in liver fat content, with the 20 milligram group having a significant decrease of 21% versus placebo, and over 40% of these patients had that 30% or greater relative liver fat reduction that we kind of look at as a marker to predict histology benefit. There were dose-ordered improvements in all measures of histology for the end of treatment biopsy. NASH resolution was observed in 26% of patients at the 50 milligram dose versus 8% in placebo. The fibrosis improvement endpoint was met by 37% at the 50 milligram versus 20% in placebo. Maybe more interestingly, patients meeting the composite of both endpoints, NASH resolution and fibrosis improvement, were 20% in the 50 milligram group and 8% in placebo. Now, the study was not designed to enroll enough patients to demonstrate statistical significance for these histologic endpoints, and none of these changes were statistically significant. However, it is notable that all the patients with a two-stage decrease in fibrosis, which are noted on the poster, occurred only in the seladelpar treatment groups. Across all serial liver labs, there was rapid, significant, durable improvements in liver chemistry tests, mostly in the range of 30 to 40%. And I would refer you to the poster to look specifically at those numbers. There were also improvements in highly sensitive CRP, bilirubin, and LDL cholesterol, as well as triglycerides. Looking at the mechanism of action of the drug and whether or not target engagement was ensued, dose-ordered increases in fatty acid oxidation and decreases in bile acid synthesis and circulating CK18 were observed. So I think I could go on, but at the end of the day, it's unfortunate that the study was stopped in the middle of it. I think it's unfortunate that the PDFF here had a dramatic change in the placebo group that led to an insignificant change in the drug dosing groups. However, there was a dose-response relationship to histology, and there were significant changes in serum liver chemistry tests. So I don't think that this mechanism is out of the running. I didn't talk about safety, but there was a very detailed safety summary in the poster, which supports the view that seladelpar is safe and well tolerated, at least in this study of 181 patients. So I think the potential use of seladelpar in NASH patients warrants further consideration, probably in combination with other agents, where the complementary effects of the multiple mechanisms on fat and lipid metabolism, inflammation, and fibrosis may lead to improved outcomes needed in these patients. So maybe I'll just stop there and see if you guys have any questions or thoughts.
It speaks to the challenges of these biopsy endpoints and interpretation, and how much really is on the line when it comes to not only efficacy but certainly safety as well. Pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, I do.
Agree.
Stephen and Manal and everyone, is there a hope in the near future that we're going to do a better job of getting our arms around this high placebo, low placebo response issue? I mean, I see some things that look like there might be promise, and then I see some things that look like there's no promise at all. So I don't know enough really to have an opinion, so I'm asking you guys.
Well, it's interesting. The placebo histologically was not the issue in this study. The issue was primary endpoint being MRI-PDFF. There is a very nice presentation. I forget which poster it is, but it's done by Lilly, that actually did a very nice review of all the studies that have looked at MRI-PDFF and shows that the placebo response rate, and I'm going to be off a little bit on my numbers because I'm doing this from memory, the absolute response change over time was about 1.5%, and the relative change was just under 6% across all these studies. So I think at least from that paper, retrospective in nature, however, we're able to get an idea of what the placebo response rate should be for these trials. And to find one of 21%, I mean, we looked at that data backwards and forwards, and there was really nothing that stood out as a predictor of how they got to 21% for placebo. It hasn't been reproduced in really any other study that I've been a part of or seen. It was just an unfortunate situation. The way the study was designed, all the histology endpoints were secondary and weren't powered to stat sig. So I think at the end of the day, the issue of placebo response is a big one. We do have a noisy endpoint, but I think the harder you make it for placebo to get to NASH resolution, the lower the placebo response rate will be. And, again, I'll just highlight what I've said before. If you have a simple NAFLD activity score of 4 and 1 point in ballooning and 1 point in inflammation and 2 in steatosis, it doesn't take much for placebo to get to NASH resolution. And that can occur just by variability of the biopsy alone or by rereading of the pathology at end of treatment. So even if the histology didn't change, knowing the intra-observer kappa statistics for ballooning, you're likely to get to 0 on a reread at least 30 to 40% of the time. So ideally, if we design clinical trials in NASH, we would set an NAS threshold of 6, 7, or 8 for enrollment. Because to my knowledge, and I may be wrong here, Manal, help me out if you know, I don't think there's been a reported set of data that shows that placebo can get to NASH resolution if the NAS is 6 or higher. It's just too big a hill to climb for placebo to do that. The problem is we can't enroll these large phase 2 and phase 3 trials where we just take NASs of 6, 7, or 8. We would have screen fail rates of 95%. I mean, if you look at at NAS scores for NASH patients in the community, again, we don't use NAS to define the presence of NASH, but we use it to define the activity in the setting of NASH. It really is a bell-shaped curve that peaks around 4 to 5, and 6, 7, and 8 are on the downhill on the right side. So it's a challenge, Roger, to get to that answer, but it's just unfortunate that this happened with the PPAR Delta. I mean, we know PPAR Alpha Delta with elafibranor didn't hit its phase 3 registration endpoint, the surrogate endpoint. However, lanifibranor, which is being presented at this meeting also, which is a pan-PPAR Alpha Delta Gamma, did, and seraglitazar, which is a PPAR Alpha Gamma, did as well. So there is something to the PPAR story. And I think ultimately it's going to be helpful in combination to have a PPAR in inner armamentarium to treat patients with NASH. I think it'll be a combination PPAR regimen or a PPAR Delta with something else that's mechanistically synergistic. I don't think the story's over yet with PPAR Delta.
Can I just ask a question? Is it worthwhile standardizing the placebo arm across all studies? Because no placebo arm is the same. Now, if I look at the hepatitis C studies that we did, some trial centres were purely trial centres, and from weeks 30 to 48, those patients had very, very few interactions. If you were a clinical trial centre like we were, who was hepatitis specialists, our patients still got seen, and we got 99% of those patients through their clinical trials. We delivered care in routine the way we delivered it in trials, because you always get a drop-off when you come off a trial and it goes into real-time practice because people just get a pill and go away. And I think, is it the standardization that's therefore needed to make sure that every placebo study follows the same? You only get the same interactions from your staff, because that can make such a difference, the way that...
So, Louise, this is an excellent point, and the Liver Forum this year actually championed this in a publication for which many thought leaders, both the FDA and the EMA, were involved in, and academic centers were involved in its writing as to how to standardize the standard of care. And it kind of came with the paper was led by Oliver Glass here from Duke, and we really kind of fleshed out the good, bad, and the ugly. And we may not be able to control the variability across all centers, across all regions, across dietary differences, and the influences that such variables play into clinical trials, let alone maybe proposing approaches to the design of clinical trials that entailed everything from standardizing a diet to standardizing a counseling approach to capturing these endpoints so we can control for them in post hoc analyses and consider them as variables, to even lead-in times for which everybody received dummy pills, not knowing that they were getting active drugs, so that if there was going to be a placebo response rate, that it happened and the true baseline was occurred after an initial lead-in. And it was very, very interesting to see how difficult it was to achieve consensus, let alone a uniform approach. And so the paper is a very eloquent deliberation and discussion of the challenges and thoughtful approaches about strategies by which to try to standardize an approach to minimizing the placebo response rate across clinical trials, such that investigators or industry sponsors can at least be knowledgeable of challenges in the initial intent of the design and the proposed analysis of data.
I was going to say, Louise, that was one of the first questions that I asked when I came into the field. What is standard of care? Because it seemed as, you see it in one place, you see it in one place. And when I was attending, I think one of my first, NASH scientific conferences in Europe, I leaned over when I saw that huge placebo effect. And I was like, I don't know, maybe that looks to me like the effect of healthcare, particularly when they were comparing a U.S. group to a European group that had a more, nationalized, a more generalized access to basic healthcare. Because, so many people in the U.S., so many liver patients aren't identified, aren't taken care. A clinical trial may be the first time anybody's paying them any attention for any of their associated conditions. And so I think it's one of the big problems, like the essential pillar problems for this field of NASH, that healthcare, placebo effect can have such a profound effect. And the threshold, as Stephen so well articulates, to get over that and to improve better than that, by necessity, needs to be so high. So I think it's something that unless we solve it, and I give the Liver Forum so much credit for bringing people together to at least try to address that. But unless we get at least some recognition or answer of that, it's going to perpetuate. It's not going to go away. So it is one of the essential barriers, that along with biopsy, to success in the field.
Okay, that was a fantastic exchange, and I think we could carry this point for another 10 minutes. We're about an hour in right now, and we still have Manal and me to do, and we're trying to get Louise to bed sometime before 2:30 in the morning her time. So, Manal, why don't you go on? Stephen, that was fantastic. And Louise, Don, Manal, great comments. Manal, why don't you go ahead with your presentation?
Sure. So I chose abstract number 57, which was presented today at the Parallel NAFLD-NASH Prognostic Diagnostic Methods session. It was presented by Dr. Grazia Pinisi from the University of Palermo, and it was entitled GEMS, which is a genetic metabolic staging predicting the outcomes of NAFLD. And I thought this was interesting because, when we typically think about risk stratification, we've done so in the light of risk stratifying patients with mild disease versus advanced hepatic fibrosis, which is where the NAFLD fibrosis score and even FIB-4 kind of rest. But this carries it one step further to doing a risk score, a model, if you will, for not necessarily fibrosis, but for outcomes, hepatic decompensation and hepatocellular carcinoma that stem from those patients who have hepatic fibrosis. And what they effectively did was attempt to look at the metabolic risk factors, the genetic background, and couple that even with a FIB-4 to create a composite score based on metabolic comorbidities, the genetic background, and the FIB-4 in predicting the outcome of liver disease. And so the cohort that they studied was 557 consecutive patients, of whom 470 had histologic diagnosis of NAFLD, and 87 patients had a diagnosis of compensated NAFLD cirrhosis based on clinical diagnosis. And all these patients had follow-up in excess of 6 months and were followed with the intent of an outcome being hepatocellular carcinoma and hepatic decompensation. And hepatic decompensation was defined as portal hypertensive related onset of ascites, for example, or variceal bleeding. And so they gave the metabolic risk factors based on obesity, diabetes, arterial hypertension, or even low DL, a presence or absence score of 0 to 1. They also gave the presence of the PNPLA3 polymorphism, a risk score of maybe 0 to 2, and stage of fibrosis based on strata of FIB-4 being low risk, intermediate risk, or high risk, a score of 0 to 2. And they combined these, although we don't know exactly how these scores were weighted in the model, they combined the scoring system into generating what is the genetic metabolic staging score, or the GEMS score, which is a categorical scoring system on the basis of a 0 to 8 to predict the likelihood of a liver-related outcome. The events were evaluated by a Kaplan curve and a Cox regression analysis that were used to identify the baseline variables and associate those variables with the events. The cohort was followed over a period of 71 months, and over that 71-month period of time, there were 60 events, 55 of which were hepatic decompensation, rejection and 5 cases of hepatocellular carcinoma. And so the likelihood of the event increased progressively with the GEMS score, with an area under the receiver operating curve for the score of 0.837. And what's interesting in the multivariate regression model, that age over 50 carried a hazard ratio of a little over 21, a low platelet count less than 110 carried a hazard ratio of 5.76, but the GEM score as a continuous variable also had a hazards ratio of 1.46. It's unclear how they dealt with age in the weighting of the metabolic risk, because we know those go hand in hand. As people age, they tend to have more metabolic syndrome. But irrespective, the GEM score managed to be a predictor of such outcomes. So what we're seeing here is a scoring model that weighs not only genetic predictors, but metabolic risks in combination with a risk stratification of fibrosis to extend such models into models that help us predict what really matters, which is hepatic decompensation or cancer. So this model certainly still needs to be externally validated, but we're really starting to see models that not only help us risk stratify fibrosis, which is important, but now trying to carry it one step forward to, okay, we know patients have advanced hepatic fibrosis, but who do we really need to care about? And it's not ultimately those just with fibrosis, it's those that are going to develop a negative clinical outcome from their liver disease. And this is where this GEMS scoring system is positioned.
Thanks, Manal. That was excellent. Questions, anybody, or comments?
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic abstract to discuss, and Manal did a terrific job of working through it. It's not easy to get through something like what she went through. It's a very detailed analytical approach to looking at these patients. But I think at the end of the day, there is some validity to this. It needs to be validated. Imagining how we can take that into the clinic is still yet to be determined. But I think it alludes to what I mentioned at the very beginning with the Alina Allen paper on MRE, where we're beginning to use non-invasive tools to predict outcome. And this is another one of those that is under development. So early days, more to come, but exciting nonetheless.
I also just wanted to say, having a very quick patient survey in terms of what did patients want AASLD to accomplish in or to focus on in NASH. This exploration of genetic factors was one of the top responses that I received. And so it's exciting to see that as a component of a predictive model.
I agree with both those comments. I believe that the more different ways we have that don't involve biopsy or don't involve tests that individually are of less, well, I'm not going to say marginal value, but far less than perfect. The more information we can bring to the party and the smarter ways we can integrate them and the more we can take advantage of artificial intelligence learning and better statistics in the process, I think the better served patients will be, and the easier it will be for us to actually figure out what's going on with this disease and all the complexities, these diseases, really, and all the complexities that underlie them. So I found the whole day, and what I'm going to get to, what I did is a little bit different, but I found this whole day really fantastic because of all the opportunities we had to think about things that way. And I agree with you, Manal. I thought it was a great paper. I thought that hard to present, hard to answer. You did a very nice job of laying it out, and I think you're right. We're going to have to learn more about it, but it's a great start. Other comments? Fine, then I will go last. And I went in a completely different direction, in large part because the two papers I most wanted to do were the Boursier paper and Yorn's, and they were taken already. So I went back in our Wayback Machine, and when we were talking about the Intercept CRL and respect for the liver and all that, we spent time talking about patient-reported outcomes and whether, in fact, PROs are a different way to think about endpoints. So poster 1662, Zobair Yanasi, with an all-star cast that also included Stephen and Mazen Nordin and Mary Ranella, among others, went into the Regenerate data to figure out what could we learn about patient-reported outcomes, and what merit did that have in terms of teaching us? Now, that's important because PROs basically are an effort to position NASH back with the old original definition of disease. If you think about the word disease, it comes literally from you split it in half, you get dis-ease. So a disease is when you feel uncomfortable or you feel pain or you feel bad in some way, shape, or form. We now use that to describe things like hypertension, where really people don't feel bad when they have hypertension. They just happen to have hypertension. Here, PROs are an effort to figure out, so what really is a disease, right? So what we talked about back with the Intercept CRL, that disease criterion couldn't be tied to long-term clinical endpoints like morbidity and mortality because it would take you forever to do a study that would get you there. But maybe there was an issue around this classic feeling of how did people feel and did PROs work? So in this case, what Dr. Younossi and the rest of the cast did was took a look at PRO scores that were collected with a total of 1,218 patients enrolled in Regenerate, and they used 3 different instruments. The Chronic Liver Disease Questionnaire, or CLDQ, the NASH version of that, CLDQ NASH, the European Quality of Life 5-Dimension Study, or EQ5D, and Impact of Weight on Quality of Life, or IWQOL. So they administered all those to patients, 24 of which were F1, 34 F2, 43 F3. 54% of the sample had type 2 diabetes. And what they learned, first of all, was that the pre-treatment PRO scores were significantly lower for NASH patients than the population norms were for EQ5D and for all 6 of the CLDQ NASH domain scores, some of those being metabolic, some of those being psychiatric. I'll get to what some of those are in a minute. They then determined that the PRO scores for NASH patients with BMI equal to or greater than 30 were significantly lower than for lean NASH patients. Okay. Now, in contrast, if you took a look at the 5 dimensions of the weight quality of life score, the IWQOL, only 2 of those domains, self-esteem and sex life, were significantly lower in the NASH patients versus the generally obese population. So obviously, what you're looking at is NASH has some effect on quality of life, but it's probably tied in some way to obesity and issues around obesity. So what the authors then did was conduct stepwise multiple regression. And what that revealed was that the lower PRO scores, the reported outcome scores, were associated with age, female gender, Americans, or as they put it here, USA enrollment, higher BMI, lower serum albumin, higher alk phos, and then a range of comorbidities in both CLDQ and NASH and IWQOL, psychiatric comorbidities, going back to the point that Donna was talking about earlier, with anxiety in Urin's paper, respiratory, GI, and musculoskeletal, and then in the CLDQ NASH, infectious comorbidities as well. And what's really noteworthy is that once stepwise regression clears out those issues, histologic fibrosis stage is not associated with any of the PROs at all. So in conclusion, a product could help a patient feel better, address disease, if you will, without having an effect on fibrosis per se. And what that might suggest is that, in fact, a PRO might be an endpoint independent of fibrosis to look at in studies, going back to where we were when we started talking about this. Well, Stephen actually raised this idea back in June, I think it was. Okay, this is a poster. So there's no conclusion beyond the lack of association between PROs and fibrosis. But it does suggest in the so what, it does suggest that a medication that deals with NASH resolution and affects obesity or some of the relevant comorbidities might do quite well on PROs, independent of whatever effect it has on fibrosis. And the now what is to consider whether it makes sense to build those things into clinical trial programs, particularly for those kinds of drugs, with the thought that that might be a reason to go for approval or an indication based on PRO as compared to based on what we've been looking at historically. You think the likeliest candidates for that would be drugs that have significant impact on liver fat and probably some other metabolic comorbidities, and maybe even weight loss if you could get there. Maybe something that's got a GLP in it and something else in combination. And at that point, I'm totally guessing. But so I thought that was interesting in that we were in June saying, gee, I wonder what happens if somebody publishes on this, and is it there? And this would suggest at least that it's a direction we might take a look at, or someone might want to take a look at for further research or for thinking about drug development. And that's my poster. Questions, thoughts?
I think my initial thoughts are that I think we have to say we probably know some of that. I think Jean also showed that in his data, that the fast progressors had stronger symptoms or stronger health-related complaints. And I think we know these patients present more to primary care physicians regularly with a lot of these reported outcomes, but nobody takes any notice. if we look at cost analysis from insurance data from American insurers, the average new NAFL diagnosis, Allen et al. In, I think, 2018, it was $7,800. So they're presenting with these reported measures, but we're ignoring them because they're non-specific. So how do we use that information and get people to say that these are real consequences of a disease that you just haven't found yet? It's an interesting thought, I suppose.
Our next session tonight is a discussion with Sonic developers and marketers of Velicor about their poster 1563 at this meeting. And in just a couple of minutes, Dr. Nizam Afdal and George Aloftiris will join Stephen and Manal and me to discuss this paper. Then we'll be back for final statements. Okay, thank you. For the next portion of this evening's episode, we are fortunate to have with us George Aloftiris, CEO of Sonic Insights Medical Corporation, and Dr. Nizam Afdal from Harvard. And they will be talking about posters 1563. And I will at this point turn it over to George to introduce how they're going to spend the next 10 minutes bringing us up to speed on the poster and on Velicor. George, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Roger. Great to be here again, and it's a pleasure to talk about our release of publication of our results from the latest Velicor study, which Dr. Nizam Afdal is going to go through. The liver meeting itself serves as a commercial release of a Velicor product. We're very excited to be here at the liver meeting and to have our distinguished guests as part of the podcast. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Delighted to have you with us, George. Dr. Afdal, you want to go ahead?
It's also a pleasure to be here. One of the issues that faces us all in clinical liver disease is how best to screen and diagnose patients who have significant liver disease. And novel technologies have always led the way in our ability to evaluate our patients. And at this liver meeting, AASLD 2020 virtual meeting, which was supposed to be in Boston, where I'm sitting and where it's extremely cold, the plan was to present live this data that we generated on approximately 136 patients, including control patients without liver disease, patients with NASH, and patients post-SVR with hepatitis C, evaluating this newly approved and novel technology of Velicor. Now, what this technology does, essentially, it enables us to evaluate patients by looking at an ultrasonic wave that measures a significant proportion of the liver, about 50 times greater than we can measure with some of our other commonly used technologies, such as FibroScan. And it enables us to look at liver and measure both the liver stiffness and also what we call the ACE score, which is the equivalent to the CAP score, which is a measurement of hepatic steatosis. And in this paper, what we did was we compared the ability to measure liver stiffness and liver fat content against MR elastography, which is one of the gold standards for the measurement of these two parameters in patients with liver disease. And what it showed was an excellent correlation, both for steatosis and for liver stiffness, which is a measurement of liver fibrosis. Without going into significant details, what this really means is that it is a technology that enables point-of-care evaluation of patients with potential liver disease. All of us who see a lot of patients and are in clinic really like tools that give point-of-care diagnosis because it enables us to make decisions at the time that we're seeing the patient. And this real-time decision-making is significantly helped by technologies like Velicor, with its ability to look at both stiffness, which is equal to fibrosis, and the ACE score, which is equal to steatosis. This then allows the clinician to make decisions as to what is the next appropriate step in the evaluation of the patient. So it's a novel technology. I'd like to say that it's very simple to perform, and a trained technician can do it very quickly. Each examination takes only approximately 5 minutes, and you're able to evaluate a significant proportion of the liver, even in patients with high BMI, up to 42 kilograms per meter squared. So I think that this has significant potential as we move forward, not just for patients that we're diagnosing in our clinics with liver disease, but also as a screening tool for its utilization detection in high-risk populations. And we're all aware that today the U.S. has an epidemic, not just the pandemic of COVID, but an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. And there is almost 35% of the U.S. population that is obese. And these type of tools enable us to identify within that population of obesity and type 2 diabetes, those patients that have significant liver disease and need further follow-up. So it's an exciting concept. It's got to be advanced further in clinical utilization and also generate some more data in clinical trials, but clearly a technology that has a role in our evaluation of patients with liver disease.
If I can add one more comment, our long-term vision is really to enable hepatology, but also beyond hepatology, gastroenterology, and other physicians who treat fatty liver disease and other sorts of chronic liver disease. And Velocor provides that ability to screen, manage patients at the early onset of disease.
You know, Ned, this is Stephen. So one of the comments you made that really rang true to me was the point of care possibility. I mean, we need something simple, something easy to use, something that is at the fingertips of primary care, gastros, endos, obesity clinics, heck, even podiatry clinics. And you might say, why podiatry clinics? It's interesting. They see more liver disease than most other people do. It's amazing to me how that came up. And I want to just highlight that for a moment. I was giving a luncheon for a primary care office, and diatrist walked in and she had podiatry on her jacket, and I didn't spend much time with her. And she says, hey, what you got going on here? I see a lot of liver disease. I said, tell me what's going on. Tell me about that. And she said, look, I prescribe Lamisil frequently for toenail fungus. And before I do, I order liver enzymes. I also see a lot of diabetic foot ulcers. And I don't know what to do with all these people that have diabetes and elevated liver enzymes. So ultimately, I think this point of care test is widely applicable. I do agree with you. We need a little more data. But to me, if we can identify the at-risk population, and it truly does correlate not only with PDFF, which is considered the gold standard for liver fat, but also MR elastography, then I think we've selected those patients that are at greatest risk for disease progression that can be treated. I think I highlighted this on our podcast tonight. Alina Allen from the Mayo Clinic has a great paper in clinical gastroenterology and hepatology that highlights MRE not only as a diagnostic test, but as a predictive model, showing in that paper that if you have a KPA of a certain cutoff, that is predictive of that patient either progressing to cirrhosis or decompensating further down the road. So if we're able to use this tool and correlate it to MR elastography, that point of care test becomes even more magnified in its ability to help us in the clinical management of these patients.
Great point, Stephen. And, I'd point out that, in fact, many of the tests that we as hepatologists recognize, like the FIB4 serological test, like FibroScan liver stiffness, have also all correlated with clinical outcomes. The real key to these technologies is how to deliver them, as you said, to the people that need to have them. The story of podiatry was excellent, really just a good story that shows that it's important. But think about everything else that obesity touches. Think about sleep clinics. Think about the issues that are out there in sleep centers, where a significant proportion of the patients with sleep apnea probably have underlying liver disease, not screened, not evaluated. Think about simple things like weight loss clinics. There's so many of them, yet we haven't penetrated them. And I think that, and I'm sure Manal will agree with this, that somewhere around 10% of all the patients that we screen at point of contact with these various tests may have underlying significant fibrosis.
Oh, at least, if not more, depending on the environment in which we sit. But what's really, I think we can't underscore enough is the essence of point of care and ease of use. And what I think is really exciting about your technology is, when we sample a liver with a liver biopsy, we get one 50 thousandths of the liver volume for sampling. And even when we sample with transient elastography, depending on the trajectory of the probe and even obesity and other variables, you get a relatively narrow window for sampling. That the ability for you to get a assessment of a broader area of liver parenchyma with your technology is exciting. And while MR-based technologies are on the cutting edge, the practicality of population-based utilization as a screening modality is challenging, not only because of access to an MR facility, access to the expertise, the ability to fit obese patients sometimes onto such platforms, not to mention the associated cost. But if you can demonstrate in broader validation and population cohorts that this approach and this technology can not only predict and stratify fibrosis effectively, but be a surrogate to a clinical outcome, I think that would completely empower both patients and providers in a point of care environment.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's very important. You really highlight some of the issues with more advanced technologies like MRI. But I think one of the other challenges that we face for all technologies that are under development is how to really get the message across to the physicians and the patients that these technologies can detect early diseases in which we can intervene, either intervene by lifestyle modification, weight loss, exercise, or more recently, as you guys well know, intervene potentially with some of the new drugs that are being developed for NASH and fibrosis. And, it's always impressive when a society or a group of physicians identifies the importance of a disease. And I think that's really highlighted by what the diabetes associations have done in highlighting the importance of NASH and liver disease in type 2 diabetes and the utilization of technologies to screen for liver disease in those patients. And I think that's important. I think we need to get our message out as hepatologists that the liver is important in metabolic disease.
Yeah, this is where I think the phrase, knowledge is power is so meaningful, because I found as a clinician, when patients don't know that they even have liver disease, there's no opportunity for change, period. It's not even on their radar. It's not on their primary care physician's radar. But the minute somebody tells them that there's an element of risk, there even is a cognitive or intentful initiatives for change, whether it be dietary or otherwise. And that may even contribute to some of the placebo response rates and that we see in clinical trials, that the ability to render the knowledge of having fatty liver disease, irrespective of stage, of disease, and to do so easily allows patients to make changes early enough to alter the natural history of their disease, irrespective of how that change is made.
I agree with that. I'll tell you what, Manal, I'm thinking back to talking about the Richard Parker and Ian Rowe Leeds work earlier in the podcast. The other thing that we're starting to see is papers coming out that suggest that primary care can, through simple interventions, identify early and in straightforward ways, even in advance of this kind of technology, which patients need to get treated. And simple early sequential screening can have real value. Now, that's at a point in time when you then have to send people off for tests. If you can get technology more readily to point of care, then at the same time that we're starting to teach primary care that they can be empowered and need to be empowered, there will then be tools to empower them. And then you really hit the whole triangle.
I think the key word there is empowerment. I mean, just think about what we've done in primary care, putting on an internist's hat. We empower our primary care physicians and our patients to monitor blood pressure, to monitor cholesterol, to monitor things that are all associated with fatty liver disease, like hypertension and like hypercholesterolemia and hyperlipidemia. These empower patients to be followed. And again, giving a simple technology that enables that to occur, I think will empower not just the physicians, but also the patients to understand that this is part of the component of the disease process that is actually quite rampant in the United States at the moment.
Well said. So, George, a slightly different question, right? As you mentioned, this weekend is the formal rollout of Velicor. People listening to this, when can they expect to learn more, be able to attain access? Where are you in that process, and what can they look forward to on the timeline?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Roger. So the release of product is coincides with the liver meeting. So people can phone, email, and expect an immediate response in terms of arranging for first a consultation with physicians that are interested in learning more. We do have in-field representation of team based in the U.S. Our onboarding of any physicians who are interested in having their practice use VeloCore is quite simple. We have our VeloCore Cloud Educational Center. People take a 2-hour webinar or on-demand video. They learn about how to use it, etc. We have a trained trainer who goes to the physician's office, trains the staff within half a day. There's another half a day of actually staff training and evaluating on healthy volunteers or patients. And that's it. Super easy, simple of getting physicians and their practices on board. And that's where we're at right now, is doing a very targeted release on the East Coast and also other centers where there is a pressing need for having VeloCore in practice. So we are starting more on the East Coast, but we're not limited to that itself. So we're very excited to have this rollout in hepatology, gastroenterology, and then we're also looking at other segments, endocrinology. That's where the bulk of the patients, and even primary care eventually.
So what should we take out of the idea that a Vancouver company has decided to do the eastern coast of the U.S. first? What will your co-West Coasters south of you have to say about that?
Well, it just turned out that we started on the East Coast, and not saying that we're discriminating West Coast, and we do have representation to come to the West Coast. It just turns out that, timing and network was situated in the East Coast, but certainly we have full intention to support all of our West Coast and Central and other fellow.
The phrase "luck of the draw" was what came to mind as I was asking. Go ahead, Stephen.
West Coast and East Coast are great, but we all know where the work gets done. That's right here in the state of Texas. So you need to get down here to Texas.
Yeah. Well, I think Stephen's right. It's not just Texas. Look, this is a national issue. This is a national problem.
Absolutely.
And what's necessary is to figure out a national solution. We keep hearing about that, about other epidemics, pandemics, but this is just as serious. This is part of metabolic syndrome, the commonest clinical disorder that there is in the United States today. And we need to figure out how to roll out these tests, educate people, and make them, as you guys have said, simple, safe, which they are extremely safe. I mean, let's just say there is no issues with performing these tests whatsoever, and effective. So, this technology could change how we practice medicine, and that's what always one wants to be a part of, at the cutting edge of how technologies change what we do in clinical practice.
Amen. And agreed. George, Nid, any thoughts you want to leave us with? Manal, Stephen, anything you want to comment on as before we step back in and wrap up the podcast for tonight?
I think what I'd say is this is a time of opportunity. So I would look at this and say that there is significant opportunity for us to really make a dent in the clinical epidemic of obesity, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease. And I know that that is one of the goals of our societies. It's one of the goals of nearly every hepatologist that I speak to, and know that they realize that this is the liver disease of the future. This is where we need to focus our efforts. And if we can be successful here and we can find the appropriate ways to use these novel technologies, then we can make an impact. And I think that's an exciting time for us. And liver disease is one of those areas where we have made huge impacts. Just look at viral hepatitis. Look at what we've done for hepatitis B. Look at what we've done for hepatitis C. Now we've turned our attention to NASH, and novel technologies will help us lead the way in dealing with this problem.
I'm sitting here listening to Nid. I've learned from Dr. Oxall over the past 20 years of my medical career, and it is awesome to see that now he is turning his effort and energy to fatty liver disease, right, Manal? Now we got another
absolutely.
chance.
And his words of wisdom haven't changed. It's all about innovation, discovery, and opportunity. And it's really exciting for me to sit back and watch this field evolve in such a manner that we are empowering providers with more tools and more opportunities to serve our patients better.
I think we should absolutely let that be the last word, Manal. That's fantastic. Okay, we're going to go back and wrap up our podcast. George, Nid, thanks for joining us this evening. And we look forward to hearing more good news about you guys as time goes by.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And just
Thanks,
to note,
Roger.
Sonic Insights launches their continuing health education program tomorrow at noon Eastern time, and I'm happy to be part of that as well. So I look forward to seeing you then, and maybe some of our listeners as well.
Thanks, Roger. We appreciate your support and look forward to having others who are interested to attend our webinar series, which is launching tomorrow and continuing to the end of the year and starting.
And in fact, if you are listening to this as part of the full podcast, tomorrow literally means tomorrow, 3 hours from when you hear this. Thank you, folks. Everybody have a great evening. Manal, see you soon. Stephen, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks, George. Thanks, Nizam and Stephen and Manal for being part of that. Now, let's wrap up for the night. I'm going to ask each of the surfers, based on what you've seen so far, what's the one most exciting thing you anticipate coming out of this meeting? Maybe something you've already heard, maybe something you're looking forward to in the next couple of days. Brave one, go first.
I think it's the exploration of lean NASH, and I look forward to covering one of those papers in a future podcast. So that's what I'm really looking forward to hearing more about.
Okay, great. Why don't we let Louise go first before she falls asleep? Go ahead. Go next, if you're ready.
She's asleep.
I'm not asleep, I was just thinking, but I suppose it's more evidence about the connection of non-invasive technologies to the outcomes and to where we're heading. And I suppose for me, it's about the practical use and the implementation in healthcare rather than 20 years down the line. And I think what I take from the article that I covered today is that transient elastography had less indeterminate patients than any other non-invasive technology. So therefore, if you're costing it, that would be your first area, because you don't want the indeterminates to need to go on. If you have less indeterminates to go on to further serial testing, you can reduce your costs. And I know that I think I listened to something from Belgium or Denmark yesterday, and that's exactly what they do. They use FibroScan, and then if it's indeterminate, they then move on. So things like that in the real practical setting to stop patients. So that's what I'm looking forward to hearing more about that during the rest of the sessions, which have been excellent so far.
We are not making incremental advances in the treatment of NASH. We're making monumental advances. And this is such a contrast to 2019. And I'm just tickled pink to see how far we've come as we begin to understand mechanism. We begin to apply that to drug development. You guys, I'm telling you, when we have podcasts on Monday, it's going to be exciting to talk about some of these developments.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen. I mean, this is not a linear advancement of knowledge. This is just an exponential growth from year to year. And what I am excited about is what we're starting to see, and we're laying the foundation for, not only on the therapeutic side, but also on the diagnostic side, is this element of integration that's going to integration of data, clinical, chemical, and even genomic data that's going to move us towards what, we're seeing of precision medicine and personalized medicine. And it's not going to be one size fits all. It can't be one size fits all. And I find that very, very exciting. And we're seeing more of that in this meeting.
Yeah, I think I land almost exactly where Manal is, that the most exciting thing to me that's going on is that dynamically what we're learning is exploding. We're seeing it in the drugs, we're seeing it in the diagnostics, we're seeing it in how the pieces go together, we're seeing it in the use of AI machine learning. This is just really an exciting time to be involved with this disease. And if someone had thought you'd be saying that the week after the Intercept got their CRL letter in the middle of the pandemic, you would have been accused of excessive optimism or maybe drinking way too much of whatever it is any of us have in front of us tonight. But I think it's how the last 6 months have played out. It's just been explosive and fantastic, and I can't wait to see what comes next. I agree with you, Stephen. I think Monday night and then Tuesday with Vlad and Jorn should just be a whole bunch of fun as we sit back and look at all this.
Science and medicine has never failed to amaze me, so I don't think the story is yet ever done.
It never is, but it's discontinuous innovation, right? You cruise along basically on flat line for a while, and then you just jump, right? And then you take off, and then you flatten, and then you jump. That ends today's episode. I want to thank our surfers, Steve and Donna, our very special guest, Manal, and an extra special thanks to Louise, for whom it's roughly 2 a.m. right about now. I want to grant another extra special thanks to our engineer, Mike Wilson, who will be up late tonight taking this entire episode, including the extra-sode, and getting it into shape to be back to you folks by tomorrow morning. Also, thanks to Polly Lee for going above and beyond to coordinate sound checks, to Buzzsprout for posting seamlessly and immediately, and to Eric Rounds for everything he always does. Finally, thanks as always to you, our listeners and subscribers, who've made this the leading fatty liver disease podcast in the world. We'll be back tomorrow night with a day 3 summary with Naimel, Corey, and Mazen Noureddin replacing Stephen and Manal. Stephen, please wish your wife a happy birthday from all of us. And for the rest of you, surfers, listeners, and meeting attendees, stay safe, get some rest. We'll see you tomorrow on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, patient advocate Donna Cryer, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.